Welcome all to NAPC's latest webinar, Preservation Justice, Making Your Local Government Preservation Program More Equitable. I'm Adrienne Burke, Principal Planner with Miami-Dade County, and I'll be serving as the moderator for this session. In honor of National Historic Preservation Month, NAPC is pleased to offer this free webinar to all. So if you would like to share the recording later with any of your colleagues, we would encourage you to do so. I'd like to take a few moments to get everyone oriented to this webinar platform if you're not familiar with it. Like other platforms, you have access to a Q&A, a chat, and polling function on the tabs at the top right of your screen. If you'd like to minimize them, click the downward arrow at the upper right corner of your screen. To bring them back up, there will be a blue chat button at the bottom right corner for you to click. To view today's presentations in full screen mode, hover over the presentation when it appears on your screen and click full at the top right. If you experience any technical issues, use the private chat function to send a message to the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions. The session is being recorded and it will be available for on-demand viewing. As a registrant, you'll automatically receive access to the recording shortly after the session is completed today. And the recording will be available for 60 days. The slides for today's presentation are also available to download in the Handouts tab at the upper right corner of your screen. A few housekeeping items for today. As you can see, continuing education credit instructions are listed on the slide showing now. You can also find these instructions repeated throughout the presentation in the chat tab. We have set aside time at the end of this session for question and answers. We will get to questions as time allows. To ask a question, please use the Q&A function at the right of your screen as opposed to the chat function. If someone else asks a question that you would like to hear the answer to, give their question a thumbs up, and that upvotes the question and moves it towards the top of the list. Also, the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions is committed to providing a welcoming space that encourages collaboration, discussion, and the sharing of ideas and points of view. Note that by attending today, you agree to the following code of conduct. Exercise consideration and respect toward presenters and participants in your speech and actions. Attempt collaboration before conflict. Refrain from demeaning, discriminatory, or harassing behavior in speech. Be mindful of your surroundings and of your fellow participants. Failure to abide by the code of conduct may result in removal from the webinar. And now I'd like to introduce today's presenters. I'll just be doing a very brief introduction, and then more information and detailed bios are available under the Handouts tab if you would like more information about today's speakers and their contact information. So with us today is Adrian Scott Fine. He's Senior Director of Advocacy for the Los Angeles Conservancy. Lauren Hoogkamer is a Principal Planner with the City of Tacoma. And Alex Westhoff is a planner with the City of San Francisco. And as I mentioned, I'm a Principal Planner with Miami-Dade County. Again, more information is available about all of our speakers today in the Handouts tab, and we're really appreciative to all of them for making time to join us today and share with us all the work that they're doing. Before we get started with our first presentation, who's going to be Adrian, we have a quick poll. We're interested in learning more about who you are, and we're really excited so many people registered for this webinar. If you could go ahead and do the quick poll. All right, looks like we're getting some answers. Primarily preservation staff. We have some board and commission members. Interested citizens, welcome. We love our interested citizens in preservation, of course. And thank you to all of the board members who are volunteers. We really appreciate your dedication to preservation. CLG coordinator from Nebraska, wonderful. Independent researcher. Graduate student, yeah, welcome to our students. Thank you for joining us today. Perfect. All right. I think we can go ahead and close that poll. Thank you everyone for being here. Yeah, and if you want to introduce yourself, I appreciate it. Everyone's just introducing themselves and saying hi in the chat. That's great. Thank you. If you want to mention who you are and where you're from, we can just kind of say hi. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adrian, and we will get going.
Great. Thank you, Adrian. Nice to see you all here today. Good morning. So I'm going to start by sharing two fears I have of imposter syndrome and white saviorism, and questioning who am I as a white privileged male to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, and why this matters in preservation. And I think talking about this subject matter for some is uncomfortable, and many people are challenged in terms of how to navigate and engage in this type of conversation, which is all the more reason why we should be talking about this specifically within the work of preservation. And so that is the goal today, is to get comfortable with the uncomfortable and to look at this from a new lens. So I want to do four things with you all today. I want to talk about how acknowledgement and representation is empowerment and why that matters. Talk about how we assess and audit and look at how well we're doing in preservation in our own communities to ensure that we're representing the full diversity of places. Talk about how being relevant is broadening our reach, and that's really an opportunity. And in terms of doing this work, that we have so many more stories to tell and places in which to tell them. And then lastly, I want to talk about how do we break down barriers? How do we look at our structures that we have implemented and determine, do those fully serve us today when we're talking about equity and justice? And this is the start of the conversation. Admittedly, there is much more work that needs to happen, especially in those areas. All of this is around the idea that the work that we do is about people and places. And I think Landmark Illinois says it best: people say places for people. So I like to acknowledge them and use that. I think the other caveat here is that we can always do better. And that is the goal, I think, through this whole program. So in my work in preservation, I've worked for some time in different places in the Midwest, the East Coast, and on the West Coast at the local, state, national levels. And I think this issue of diversity, equity, inclusion, and access is relatively new. However, we've been talking about it for a long time in maybe different ways. And I think there are nuances to it that have changed the conversation in terms of our understanding of this and why it's important. In my career, I've always worked with commissions, either as a staff, as a commission member myself, or as an applicant. And I think this is one of the hardest jobs that we have in local preservation, but it's also one of the most meaningful in terms of doing this type of work. I will also say, until probably the last 10 years, I didn't fully see myself in this work. And that is, not only am I a white privileged male, I'm a white, gay, Jewish privileged male. So there's layers to stories within places, there's layers to stories within people. And I think the more that we see ourselves in preservation being represented and seeing how places tell stories about ourselves, that's a way in which we open up and we broaden the application and also the relevance of the work that we do. And the more that people in our communities see themselves, that is when the story really is telling a full story of our communities. So I want to do, again, four things. And let me start again with representation and acknowledgement, how that can be empowering to a community. And I think we start here that we can do better. Also understanding that these are limited resources. They are fragile, they're vulnerable resources. And so we're often talking about places that have been overlooked, hidden in plain sight, but also extremely threatened or at risk. And we need to do more before we lose more of these places in terms of being able to tell the full story of our communities. Also acknowledging that this is a conversation we've been having for some time, and also acknowledging that in some ways the system that we have been put in place in terms of preservation has some flaws, and that we are part of, when we look at the broad understanding of systemic racism, we are part of that story in terms of how we've put structures into place that maybe fetishize or prioritize architecture and design in beautiful places, over culturally significant places that may be looking ordinary or marginal, or places that you would never expect to be codified as being historic. And that's part of our story. In the story also is understanding that there's a long history of racism, and how does that work in our communities, from outright discrimination to redlining to federal, state, and local programs that favor mostly whites over people of color, and also racially restrictive covenants to urban renewal, often referred to as Negro removal, and also looking at things like zoning, land use, which is embedded in many of our communities and in some cases has racist overtones. Understanding that, acknowledging that, is part of the understanding in moving forward as we think about how this has played out in our communities and what does it look like. The other piece to this is thinking about how do we confront rather than omit our difficult histories. Do we embrace it or do we erase it? And I think it gets to these challenging questions about how do we look at some of the places that have become symbols in terms of what they represent and the stories they tell. They're not always positive. They're not always happy histories. And the question of, do we omit or do we edit out these places? And this is a difficult, admittedly complicated, challenging process of how we go about doing this. But I think it raises questions about, can we recontextualize these places? Can we take ownership of the story? Can we acknowledge without commemoration or celebration? And how do we learn from these places and move forward if possible? Or do we lose them? Do we demolish? Do we erase? And I think that is one approach that we're seeing in some communities and places across the country. But in terms of healing, reconciling, and having some of these difficult conversations, when we erase the past, we lose an opportunity to be able to talk about this history and where we were in the past and where we are today. I think West Joe here says it best in terms of a place. In this particular case, the Black Cat in Los Angeles, designated in 2008 for its LGBTQ history, where he says there's something about touching a building or seeing how it really looked, can spur your imagination, deepen your understanding about significance. People need to know where we came from. And this place is both about police brutality, harassment in 1966 and 67, but it's also about uprising of the LGBTQ community and being able to have a place in which you can understand that. So like Stonewall, the Black Cat tells that story, actually before Stonewall, in terms of understanding and the importance of having it saved and also acknowledging a broad range of history and by different people and stories within that complex scenario. I think much of our work is that there's growing emphasis on this relationship between people plus places, again, people-centric preservation, and also understanding that it's a layered full story. Sometimes we have picked and or chosen pieces of the story to tell without telling the full complex story of a place. And so that is broadening. It's also the idea that it's less about what a place looks like. Does it look historic? That's not really the story. I think in these three examples, it's not at all about what the place looks like per se. It's more about what the story the place is telling. And so with this, lastly, it's the representation, that being seen, being counted, being understood, being acknowledged, whether it's Black heritage, Japanese American heritage, or LGBTQ heritage, it matters in terms of the work that we're doing at the local level through commissions and through local landmarking designation. This place is, this is the Paul Revere Williams House in Los Angeles. This was designated this year. And you can look at the building, you can see it has some condition challenges, but this is not a place that was designated for this being a great example of arts and crafts architecture or a bungalow. It was designated for the story it tells about Paul Revere Williams. And for those that do or don't know his story, he's a celebrated Black African-American architect that worked in Los Angeles predominantly, but beyond that. And he is beloved by many in terms of what he accomplished and was a mentor to many other Black architects that followed him. But what this place tells, this is a place in which he, as a Black man in a Black family, lived in this house for 30 years, not by choice, but by circumstance. And this place really tells the story of his experience and the full story, but also the experience of many people of Black, BIPOC conditions in terms of a time and period when racial restrictive covenants and redlining limited their possibilities. So it was very important to be able to designate and landmark this house to be able to tell that story. Again, it colors in the edges of his story and is the full story of Paul Revere Williams so that you understand more about his personal experience, not just about what he designed. So I want to move to the second point here, assessing how well we're doing. And I would encourage every community to take an honest look at this in their own work of the local preservation programs. And so if you look at Los Angeles, we have a robust local landmark program as well as local historic districts. We have 35 local historic districts and then about 1,200 plus locally designated landmarks. We call them historic cultural monuments in Los Angeles. Here's the breakdown. So in terms of auditing your preservation program and thinking about who have you left off, who have you not yet told their story through the power of preservation, here you see roughly a little less than 11% of the designated landmarks currently in the city of Los Angeles represent diverse stories, diverse narratives, layered histories in terms of this. Predominantly, 89% is focused on architecturally centric, white-centric heritage. And that's not uncommon across the country. If you look at the National Register, it's something more like 8 or 9%. So Los Angeles is doing a little bit better than the national average. But I think if you look at communities across the country, you'll see that it's probably less than 10% on average for most places across the country. So I'd encourage you to think about how well you're doing. Again, taking an audit and a self-reflection of how well preservation is being represented in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. So this is what we've done really well in terms of telling a white, male, largely affluent narrative. That's covered well in terms of preservation, even when it's not the full, complete story. And to illustrate this, this is where the opportunity comes in. So we have the ability to tell lots of stories in terms of preservation and the work that we do. And if we look at this from an example, the Pacific Design Center in West Hollywood, it's a 1970s era place. And 1970s buildings are coming of age. They're now in that 50-year mark, whether we're ready for it or not. It's a period of time which we can tell lots of different stories. And so I'll use this as an example. This is the Blue Whale, built in 1975. But if you look at the narrative in terms of popular material, articles, professional journals, this is the story that you see. It's designed by Cesar Pelli with Gruen. It was a very significant building of its time, and it's one of three that make it this complex of the Pacific Design Center. It looks to be, this is the story. And as a designated local landmark in the city of West Hollywood, if you look at their website, if you look at their survey and historic context statement, and even look at recent correspondence from Cesar Pelli himself, it seems to be a story about Cesar Pelli as the sole designer for the Blue Whale, as well as the designer for the other two buildings. So you must assume, or you assume, that to be accurate, right? Wrong. So this is the full story of the Blue Whale. And by telling the full story means you have to share Norma's contribution. Norma Merrick-Sklaric. She was the architect, along with Cesar, who designed this building. And when you shade in and tell the full story of this place, both Cesar and Norma, that's a much richer story in terms of her contribution and what she was doing. And as an African-American woman architect, what she had to overcome and be part of this. So we need to ensure that we're not leaving off parts of the story, ensuring that we're telling the full story in the terms of the work that we're doing, even places we've already landmarked, and ensuring that they're complete in terms of their narratives. It's also this idea that we're talking about layered histories, often multiple stories within one place, and this idea of also intersectionality. So if we look at this building, the Women's Building in Los Angeles, also a designated landmark at the local level, it's not just one story. So yes, it was built as originally a Standard Oil office building, and it is beautiful architecture. But the real story, and probably the more powerful story, is what came later in the 1970s, and that's when it became the Women's Building. And so it's really a story, in this case, about the 1970s, about civil rights, about arts, about LGBTQ plus heritage. That is really the full frame of why this place is important, and to ensure that it's again represented in the stories that we're telling through preservation at the local level about women's heritage, about feminism, about LGBTQ plus stories. And again, how important and how powerful and empowering it was for this community to have this building recognized and designated at the local level, and we hope soon also at the national level. And part of this, and I would acknowledge fully, the city of Los Angeles has done a really good job in terms of trying to understand these stories and put it into context. And that's why I think it's so important to do historic context statements, that we can be doing more of this at the local level. It's basically addressing this question of we don't know what we don't know until we put some of these places into context and understand their stories, whether it's LGBTQ plus or African American or Japanese American. This is just some of the context that the city of Los Angeles has done, but it's really critical in terms of, again, understanding this so that we can understand what needs to be designated, and also how we engage with different communities within our larger community itself. So the third and fourth pieces I'm going to wrap up into one. And again, this is about how we ensure that we're being relevant by broadening our reach, but also this issue of how do we break down the barriers and think about where have we unintentionally put in place problems that may make it difficult for different communities to access preservation or even see themselves within the work that we do. And I'll use this as an example in terms of that conversation. This is the Sister Mary Corita studio in Hollywood. Here we see it in the mid-1960s. Sister Mary Corita was significant for as an American artist, designer, educator. She was a former religious sister, but from the 1960s, she was developing art with students in this very simple building. She's sometimes referred to as LA's pop art nun in terms of what she was accomplishing here. But this is where we encountered, I would say, what we're encountering many challenges right now in the work of preservation. So when the building became at risk in terms of demolition, a community came together, the Corita Art Center, as well as many former students and those in the preservation community, to advocate for preservation of this building. You can see it as it looked in the 1960s, and also as it looked in the later alterations today, but alterations that occurred in the 1970s all the way into the early 1980s. Clearly, the building has changed over time. And this raised a question, and a question that we've been dealing with in the preservation movement for many years, about this issue of integrity, physical integrity, and that being a criteria or consideration of whether a building is or is not eligible. And in many ways, we treat it as an on-off switch. Either it has integrity or it does not have integrity, as more of an absolute. And this idea, should we be doing it that way, or should it be treated as a continuum? And we, again, have had lots of conversations about integrity criteria and how this is addressed, but we have yet to, I would say, across the country, figure out how best to address this so that it's ensuring that places that are culturally significant have a way to be designated and find their way into the local preservation program within our communities across the country. In Los Angeles, there is no integrity criteria in terms of the formal process. However, it's still being used in many ways in terms of consideration of whether a building or not should be determined eligible. And here you see, this is a staff recommendation at the time that was looking at this building, again, the Sister Mary Corita studio. And as many staff do, in terms of looking at this and looking at the preservation standards and the 7 aspects of integrity, you would be drawn to conclude that based on extensive alterations, that this building is, altered, it's lost character defining features, it does not meet the criteria, therefore it's no longer eligible, or it's not eligible for local landmarking status. And that's what happened in this particular case. However, in this instance, what it does, and this again is as a barrier in some ways that we do again, not intentionally, but we do to communities, especially for places and communities that care about these places, we require them essentially to mount a defense to counter the preservation structures that limit culturally significant places from being recognized. In this particular case, having to make a strong case about why Corita was significant. Again, in many ways, she is a contemporary to someone like Andy Warhol, a white male, which you probably wouldn't question, a place that he was instrumental in terms of a studio. Or we also go through the lens of the 7 aspects of integrity. In this particular case, the applicant did a good job in terms of breaking down what are the primary aspects that are relevant in this particular case, what are the aspects that are secondary in terms of design, materials, workmanship. The fact that this building was altered is almost immaterial in this particular building. It's more about what took place there, less about what the building looks like. And also this question of, would you be able to recognize the building if you looked at it today? And because of impassioned and community activism and people that showed up, and in my experience, one of the most moving public hearings I've ever experienced in terms of a local landmarking, the community made their case and they were effective. And the Cultural Heritage Commission in Los Angeles supported this nomination. I have to say, if people didn't show up, I'm not sure this building would be designated today if you just looked at it from the traditional approach of does it or does it not have integrity. So I'm going to leave on this point in terms of these are 5 things I think we need to ponder further. It's not something we can address in this particular session today, but things that we need to look at further in terms of how we address period of significance determinations. Some of them can be subjective. Also, this issue, again, do we need to reassess or revamp the way we look at integrity considerations, as it can be a barrier and a form of exclusion? The idea that physical condition is often confused with physical integrity when they're completely different things, and that local preservation ordinances and criteria differ wildly across the country, some of which give priority more in architectural versus cultural significance. And lastly, that what we do is people-centric preservation, ensuring that there's greater relevance and that it's about people first. And the more that we do this and we fill in the holes and the full complexity of our communities, then we are going to be more likely to be telling the full story in terms of why preservation matters in terms of the work that we do. And with that, I'm going to turn it over back to Adrian. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrian. That was a really great start. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren to do our next presentation.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Lauren Hoogkamer. I'm a principal planner from the city of Tacoma. And before that, I ran our outreach and engagement for the Historic Preservation Office for many years. One of my first jobs was actually writing the Latino Civil Rights Context Statement for Survey LA, so small world. And I apologize that I sort of look like the ghost of preservation past with my camera, so bear with me here. I'm really going to be talking about how do we bring it all down, right? How do we create a program that embodies diversity, equity, inclusion, and how do we build an audience and engagement strategy? So first of all, I just wanted to start by defining what some of these things mean. Diversity is the who. So if you look around the room and you see only people that look and think like you, then you don't have diversity, right? Diversity is making sure that there are different types of people in the room. Inclusion is really, are they allowed to participate, right? So if you look around and you see diversity and you think that's great, but then who are the decision makers, right? If all the decision makers are still only the people that look and think like you, then that's not inclusion. And equity is really about the justice of it all, right? Policies and practices and procedures to ensure equitable outcomes. And that's where it gets really hard because we have to start making calls about resources, about time, about where we put our efforts in, because there are communities that have been disenfranchised, that have received less resources over time, less attention. And we need to probably emphasize those a little more than other communities. And for me, this work is really personal. I got into this field because I felt like there weren't people who looked like me in the stories that we were telling, and there weren't people like me who were telling the stories, right? So for me, this work is very close to my heart. So first, I want to talk about how we all have biases, right? We all have assumptions that come from who we are as people, where we grew up, our culture. I, as a cisgender woman of color, have biases from my experiences, right? And they aren't necessarily wrong or right, but we need to be aware of them, and they can make us uncomfortable when we have to change our biases. This is a picture from the Bahamas. When I was there many years ago, I spoke to a man who said they don't like historic preservation there because the historic preservation commissions or whoever wouldn't allow them to paint their historic buildings these bright colors, right? Because they want to appeal to the cruise ship tourism. Now, true or not, that's a bias, right? It's a bias about what preservation means, but it's also about how preservation can uphold Western biases, right? And it can uphold architecture over cultural significance, right? And it can also uphold ideals that come from Western biases, such as that brighter colors on these historic buildings might be tacky. And so standards and policies and laws, like all of our commissions use, those are great because they can really help provide a level of fairness, right? So when you're a commissioner and you're judging an application, you really want to check, what is my opinion? What's something I just don't like? And versus what actually matches my criteria or my preservation ordinance, right? And judging it by those standards. But I think it's also important to remember that a lot of those standards are embedded with systemic biases, right? They were created to not be inclusive, right? They weren't created to include cultural sites. So I think sometimes we also have to see, are there biases in the way that we do business? And to get to a better outcome, do we need to change some of those laws, those standards, those criteria? And so I am going to turn off my camera for a second and play a quick video about how to think about unconscious bias.
Your brain, by some accounts, receives roughly 11 million pieces of information each second, but your conscious brain is only able to process about 40. How do you handle all the rest? You handle it because you're really using two brains. Your conscious brain, which works with facts and data, has very little capacity and processes information slowly, and your unconscious brain, which is habit and intuition driven, has huge capacity and is really fast. One of your unconscious brain's best tricks is its ability to recognize patterns and use them to assign people and things to categories, allowing your unconscious brain to deal with all of the known, not dangerous issues, and leave only the few unknown or dangerous issues to your conscious brain. This allows us to recognize a pattern and act on it, rather than having to think about every interaction as if we were experiencing it for the first time. We can glance at that four-legged animal and know if it's a wolf or a cocker spaniel. That recognition allows us to make assumptions about the animal facing us, that the wolf belongs to the wild animal category and is likely to be dangerous, or that the cocker spaniel is in the domestic dog category and not likely to be dangerous. The assumptions we make about these pattern groups are likely to be based on our own experiences, on information we have gained from our culture or background, or from the media we listen to or people we admire. Unfortunately, those assumptions are often wrong. When we categorize people, our brains apply two other tools. One is affinity bias, a hardwired preference to respond positively to people who look, sound, and act like ourselves. Brain imaging scans show that when people are shown images of faces that differ from their own, it activates in milliseconds activity in the part of the unconscious brain that alerts us to possible danger. This may reflect a survival tool left over from ancient times when danger often came from those outside our immediate group. Today, however, this means the associations and biases are likely to be unconsciously activated every time when we come across a member of a group, even if we consciously reject group stereotypes. In addition to affinity bias, our unconscious brain categorizes people into groups and then connects those groups to our learned ideas or constructs about what is good or bad. Now, we've decided whether someone is like us or not, and whether they're good or not, all within milliseconds of meeting them. So, what can you do to manage your unconscious biases? You've already started by just learning about unconscious bias. Now, identify your own biases and address one at a time by building inclusive habits. Remember, if you do not intentionally, deliberately, and proactively include, you will unintentionally exclude.
Right. While I switch back to my slides, in the handouts, you'll see two other videos. One of them is about systemic racism, and one of them is about should you feel guilt if you are from a privileged group. And I think that doing all this work, right, it really starts with ourselves. It really starts with being vulnerable, being humble, and being willing to be in that uncomfortable space. So then I want to move to how do you start building that audience, right? And it's really about it starts with who's talking and who's listening, right? And is your speaker or whoever is leading your program or whoever's your representative, is that appropriate for your audience and for your material? I think for some of us who are, quotation marks, experts in the field or spent a long time in this field, we often feel that we have the qualifications or the authority to speak on many things, right? But I think that we really have to recognize that for some things, it's not for us to speak on if that's not our background, our experience, our walk of life. And so this is actually a picture that was on TikTok and many other social media platforms of a teacher who was trying to do a lesson about some Native American song or joke, and it obviously did not come off well. She is not somebody who should be telling that story, who should be making that joke, who should be presenting it in that way. And so I think if you're going to have speakers or presenters or staff or commissioners, right, start working in this space, they really need to reflect the diversity and the experiences of the audience that you're trying to reach. And so I found this list of how to be an anti-racist, and I think it's a really great reminder of where to start, right? First, acknowledging that we are not the only ones who are doing this work. People have been doing this work in many communities for many years. So acknowledging that they might have that expertise and that history, supporting and aligning with those communities. And then I think for us, one of the most important things is amplifying BIPOC voices and organizers. We don't need to be the star of every presentation, of every show, of every story, right? We really should be making space for people who've been doing this work and experiencing these stories and these walks of life, making space for them to tell their story or to share their lessons. Also asking communities what they need. So we don't have to go in there and assume that because a community looks a certain way that they're uneducated, right? Or that they don't understand. So really just finding out what are their concerns and issues, and then activating our own places of power, right? As either, people who work for the government or who manage commissions or who are in charge of programs, right? Activating our power and privilege so that we can shift resources to these under-recognized, under-resourced communities. And so one question I hear a lot is, well, there aren't a lot of, experts who are BIPOC or women in the field, right? And I think we need to broaden sometimes what we think of as an expert, right? There are people who are working on the built environment, working in their community, working on history, working on cultures. Oh, something just popped up on my screen. Sorry. Working on cultural issues. They may not be calling themselves planners or preservationists, right? And so I just put an example here on the screen of some of the different groups that we work with in Tacoma. And it can be people who are organizing on the grassroots. It can be nonprofits. It can be cultural groups. It can be a local tribe. It can be a lot of different types of groups who are doing this work, but calling it something different. So I think what's also important is to make sure that whatever you're about to say, your content, right, and your message is appropriate to your audience, right? So understanding what your audience needs, where they come from, what they're looking for, what they're interested in. If you are trying to get a lot of support for your, historic mansion district, it might not be great to give that presentation to your perhaps audience who is low income and looking for housing and struggling in this housing market, right? So really aligning those things. This black and white picture is an example from Tacoma. It's from our West End neighborhood, which has a lot of great mid-century examples. A few years back, it was a proposed conservation district for its mid-century significance. And I love mid-century. I thought it was a great example. This actually went through and passed the Landmarks Commission and went to our Planning Commission and City Council. And there it did not pass because it really was, the messaging at the time was not appropriate for where we were in society. Because what was going on with this neighborhood is when it was built and designed, it was built with racial exclusive covenants. So on the neighborhood covenants, it said, people of color and Black people cannot live or be in this neighborhood unless they were day workers. Now, this isn't something that's obviously enforced anymore, but it was something that was part of its history. And at the time, I think we didn't do a good enough job of teasing that out, of dealing with what it meant to preserve the history of a site like this without fully addressing that racial covenant history. And at the time when the city was really wanting to promote equity of inclusion, that message just did not hit right. It did not fly over right. So it failed there, not on architectural messaging, but really on the cultural history. And what was great that came out of it is that the state changed the laws so that these types of covenants could be removed without a full vote of the neighborhood, so they could be stricken from the property records. But it's an example of how messaging can really affect your preservation movements. So this is just an example of power dynamics. In both pictures, this shows our mayor there with the blue shirt with the little doggy, right? One where she's at the dais and one where she's just out in the community. And I think if you're always asking people to come to you when you're on the dais, when you're at commission, when you're seated in a space of authority, it's really uncomfortable for people to approach you. And to get involved, right? There's a power dynamic there that makes it where people might not feel comfortable talking to the government or sharing a vulnerable story, right? Or exposing a vulnerable situation they are in, perhaps being low income, perhaps being not a citizen. And so in this other picture, right, where she is out in the community doing a community walk, you can see that the tone is really different. People are a lot more comfortable. So really think about where you are and how when you're asking people to come towards you. Finally, I want to talk about access, right? So if you're having all of your meetings or events at City Hall, that's making it very difficult for people from different neighborhoods to attend, right? They have to take time off. They have to find transportation. They have to come across town. So we really try to do events and activities all over in different neighborhoods. We try to do them at times when people can attend. So after 5:30 or on weekends or at lunch. So people don't have to take time off work, school. And then also thinking about access of where are people, right? So where are they physically, but where are they also online? So using social media as a tool because that's where people are sharing information. Part of this is also language access, making sure things are translated, making sure you have materials in that match the demographics that you're talking to. And finally, just pulling it all together, right? So these are examples of some of our preservation months in Tacoma. And as you can see, we really de-emphasize just architecture, right? And we're really talking about arts, culture, different types of events like trivia, bike rides, movies. So things that really would attract people to attend and come on their free time, right? And so I think a lot of people on their free time don't want to come to a commission meeting, right? But maybe they will come to a talk or a movie or a game night. So just thinking about it differently. So that's all I have. Here's my contact information, and the slide should be in the handouts. And I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Really appreciate the presentations. I believe we have another quick poll. Perfect. Thank you so much. So we're just interested in hearing from you, the audience. How much do you feel you have integrated diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility into your preservation programs? You'll see some options there: a lot, a little, hardly at all, or nothing. And as it's coming back, it looks like pretty good. Almost half have done a little bit, or maybe doing at least some awareness of the issues and needs. Leave it open for just a few more seconds. So the majority are saying you have done a little bit, taken some actionable steps, which is great. And kind of, going back to what Adrian talked about in the beginning, this is new for a lot of people. It is something that's going to take a lot of time. And so no judgment if you aren't as far along as you had hoped to be. We're all doing this together, learning together. It's great. All right, so I'm going to share my slides and talk a little bit about what we have been doing here in Miami-Dade County. And before I start, just want to make sure, recognize the Tequesta, their ancestors in the Seminole, on whose lands we are here in what is known as Miami-Dade County, as well as the state of Florida being home to the Seminole, Miccosukee, Muskogee, and Choctaw, and individuals of many other Native groups. We do and are fortunate to have an active archaeology program here in Miami-Dade County. We work pretty closely with our Tribal Historic Preservation Office and are hoping to work with them more in some of our upcoming efforts here around preservation in the county as well. So I mentioned this book in one of the questions that someone already asked, The Color of Law. It's really excellent reading, especially if you're working in historic preservation or in urban planning or an adjacent profession. It's really, really chock full of information that I think is necessary and vital for us as preservation practitioners to understand about the foundation of planning and zoning in the United States. And this is just sort of a mission statement we have for our preservation office, given the racist foundation of planning and zoning ordinances and policies in the United States and the decades of implementing those inequitable policies, we in our office strongly feel it is our duty as public servants to use our knowledge and positions to actively work on proactive strategies that seek to reverse the impact of those policies. And that's really kind of the lens through which we are bringing this work to you today. So I'm going to go over a few things that have been touched upon a little bit already in the presentation, but I think are important in understanding what are some action steps that you can take in your community, and also understanding that the resources in preservation programs vary drastically, right? So I currently work for a really big jurisdiction, but our office is still very small. We're really technically only 2.5 people. Prior to this, I worked in a really small city. And so I'm very mindful of the fact that not every preservation office or commission, has a lot of staff or funding. But I think that some of these actions are still doable regardless of the resources you have at your disposal. And so that can be really important in at least getting started and taking some of these steps. So the first one is really looking at and knowing and understanding the history of your community specifically. And I think that's really important. My background is as a history major before I got into preservation. And so this is something I love to do, but preservation with its emphasis on architecture sometimes gets away from the history part. And so I think something that communities and programs can do is really understanding your community locally and the history of your community and how these types of policies were implemented. And so this is something that we did in our office, and we did some research and went back through newspapers, et cetera, and looked at the history of specifically planning and zoning policy in Miami-Dade County. We also have plenty of other things in our community as far as policing and law enforcement that are huge issues here as well. But for purposes of this exercise, we were looking specifically at planning and zoning policy. So these are just some newspaper articles that you can see from, as early as the turn of the 20th century, the types of news articles that were being relayed to people in Miami-Dade County regarding racial segregation and separation in other parts of the country. And then, 1915, looking at ordinances regarding segregation, all the way up until the 1940s. And too short to go into, or the presentation today is too short to go into a lot of detail, but Miami-Dade has an extensive history of racist planning and zoning policy, and it did continue well into the 1940s. And these are just some other examples of things that were done, not just here, but elsewhere across the country, specific covenants and restrictions, plats, et cetera, restricting properties to Caucasian race only, advertisements used, for example, this one at the upper left, talked about restricted and exclusive. There was the use of coded language like that. Altos Del Mar is a big subdivision, and you can see it says protective restrictions. These were all things, coded language that people understood to mean that these were segregated areas. So again, just more research we did locally on our community to understand how these policies actually were implemented on the ground where we are. And then many of you are probably familiar with the red line maps. I won't go into a lot of detail about that, but we did, look at how that was implemented here in Miami-Dade County, and then came across things in our research such as this plan that was approved by the Dade County Planning Council in 1937 called the Negro Resettlement Plan, which defined only 3 areas in our unincorporated county where Black Miami residents could reside. And that was, seen as very progressive and important to the community at that time. But looking back, it's just terrible. It's like, this is the foundation of our planning practice in Miami. And this is why we feel so strongly that we have to be very proactive to reverse these types of policies. And that is because, in part, these policies still affect our communities today. Neighborhoods that were historically redlined still have economic disinvestment and different economic outcomes, educational outcomes, environmental justice issues, public health issues. This is a particularly big issue here in Miami-Dade County relative to climate change. Our neighborhoods that were historically redlined are also our hottest neighborhoods. They are some of our neighborhoods that have significant flooding problems. They're still on septic tanks versus sewer, et cetera. There's the legacy continues. So without understanding the history and why these things happened and why they're still impacting our community, we really don't have a good place to start. So we really need that foundation in order to understand what we're doing. And I think all communities, regardless of size, this is something you can look into and understand. So these are just some of the ideas that we've been looking at as far as the larger planning issues. And this is something too, we in our Historic Preservation Office, we did this research, and then we have shared what we've learned with our Development Services Division, with the remainder of our planning department. So that's another thing I think that we as plant preservation professionals can do, is kind of take on some of this information and then share it with our colleagues so that everyone understands where we're operating from. We've also shared it with our preservation board and with the City of Miami Beach Preservation Board and some of the other preservation programs here in the county, so that everyone kind of understands, again, the history of what the county in particular was doing. But these are just some different examples. I won't go into detail on these, but there are different strategies and methods that we've learned about from other communities that we're exploring. So the second strategy that I wanted to talk about, and this is something that I learned about, it was done, I believe, in the city of Alexandria and then also King County, Washington. And I saw someone is here, I think Sarah's here. We did a data audit. We wanted to understand concretely what we were working with in terms of our historic designations. So, we felt confident that we could anecdotally say our designations are not representative of our community, but we wanted to see that actually in numbers. So as part of this exercise, we did this in fall 2020, and we actually crunched the numbers for the state of Florida as well. We did requested the data from our state office, and we went ahead and did the exercise at the state level to share with our board and at the local level. So you can see here again, this data is a little outdated at this point, but you can see here, state of Florida not doing super well in terms of diverse sites on the National Register. And then Florida Master Site File, that is our state inventory of historic places. And, we're not doing very well with documentation either, which is a whole nother thing that is really, really important. It's one thing to be on the National Register. It's another thing to even have these sites identified and documented. And that I'll mention when I mention our survey work. So we also did this at the local level with our county designated sites. And that's the orange, if you look at the orange row. So as I mentioned, we have an archaeology program. We are very excited to have that. We've had it for a long time. So we have a fair amount of sites representative of our indigenous populations protected through our archaeological work program. Some of the numbers in particular for African American and Black culture and women's history, I actually think those numbers aren't quite accurate when I did this, only because our designation reports don't specifically reference the African American history or the women's history, but based on the site, it's very likely that history exists. So we included those, even though that's not why they were designated, and the designation reports lack that information. So for example, buildings in Miami-Dade County can be historically were constructed of what's called oolitic limestone. It's common knowledge that most of the construction workers working with oolitic limestone were Bahamian. So if a building was designated because it's architecturally significant as an oolitic limestone structure, there is likely a history there with the Bahamian population and the workers, but that's not part of the story. So we included it anyway, but you can see here our numbers are low. The biggest one that jumps out as our example of why we're doing this is that Miami-Dade County currently is about 70% Latino, Hispanic, Latinx, 70%, and 1% of our sites reflect that history and heritage. So we have a lot of work to do to tell the story of our community. And then we just out of interest looked at things that were designated based on categories. And again, typically most of it is based on architecture or history. So as Adrian mentioned, one of the challenges with designation of sites, and this is the third thing I wanted to mention, is ordinances. I think there's a significant amount of work that we can do at the local level to revise our preservation ordinances. And we are lucky that since the beginning of our preservation program in 1981, our ordinance has been very flexible. We aren't tied to a specific number of criteria for designation. One is enough. And that one can be this one that's highlighted in the middle, which is associated with distinctive elements of cultural, social, political, et cetera. It does not have to be just architecture. And I saw some comments about, whether you're a CLG and utilize, the National Park Service is directing use of the interior standards. We don't do that. And we are a CLG. We only look at our ordinance for designations. So I don't know if we're doing something wrong, but we've been doing it for years. The state's well aware of our designations and what we do. So, this is a really big deal. Flexible ordinances are a really big deal. And that is a place that I think all local governments can really look to see how your ordinance is or is not supporting efforts to make your program more inclusive. So for example, I'll just give a couple of quick case studies. The Richmond Heights Historic District. This is our first district that was based primarily on cultural significance. It's very small. It's only 26 homes. It's a much larger neighborhood, but the core, the first 26 homes are part of this district. It was the first private development in the county established exclusively for African Americans, and it was originally really targeted towards World War II veterans. And the big issue and why this is unique is that, again, the designation of the district is based on the historic context and this association with specific people. It is not based on architecture. The alterations to homes still require some review, but in the designation report, we specifically call out that architecture is not the primary point of designation. And so we are very flexible in terms of our reviews for our certificates of appropriateness for homes in the historic district. The second example is the Liberty City Elks Lodge, which we designated last year. This is a local representation of a nationally significant African-American fraternal organization, the Improved Benevolent and Protective Order of the Elks of the World. It's one of the last remaining active lodges in the county. And because of that cultural history, we designated this property last year. The owners, the Elks, approached us about designating this property. And as you can see, the building has been changed. The picture in the bottom is from the early 70s, but the building has been significantly altered since it was built. However, that again, that's not why we're designating it. It's not for the architecture. Again, and this is getting into new territory. Our board struggled with this one a little bit in designating it because we barely are regulating it in terms of architecture. That facade area, we put some conditions around that as contributing features. It's really the form and massing that we're interested in. And then we would review a demolition proposal in any new construction. But we're not regulating doors, windows, roofing, colors, signage, nothing. And that was important for us in working with the owners of the building as well, with the Elks, because that was of concern to them, that they didn't want to be overly regulated, because again, that's not why they were seeking the designation. And it was really important that we listened to them, why they felt the designation was important, what they were interested in. And I think that's something we have to take into account when we're looking at designations. But this is new territory. What are we doing with our preservation programs if we're not regulating buildings in the way that we're used to? And I don't think we have the answers for that 100% yet, but something we need to figure out. And then lastly, these are just some other things that we're doing. And I mentioned the survey effort as the last tool. We are working on a survey right now Our county has not been comprehensively surveyed since 1980. So we have 200,000 buildings that need to be surveyed. In order to help us prioritize that, our first phase has been kicked off this year, and we are focusing on two areas. One area is facing significant development pressure, but then two, historically excluded communities. Again, I mentioned that documentation. We're not even documenting these sites for our state inventory, let alone worrying about National Register yet. We just need to find these sites and understand from the communities what these sites are and what's important to them. So we are working on that now through next spring, and then we'll move into phase 2. And my contact information is there. It's also in the handouts as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alex so that we still hopefully have some time for Q&A.
Hello. So slides. So hello. I hope you're all enjoying the panel so far. Thank you to all of my co-panelists for their excellent presentations, and thank you all for attending. My name is Alex Westhoff. I'm a senior preservation planner with the San Francisco Planning Department. And my goal today is to share some general information about the racial and social equity work at San Francisco Planning and discuss how the department's focus on equity has resulted in a hard look at our preservation practices and policies. Specifically, I'll overview a handful of tools we have employed in a concerted effort to be more inclusive. 2 main points before I jump in. Firstly, the equity work I will be discussing is a department-wide project with input from a wide variety of community groups, department staff, and both our planning and historic preservation commissions. So I want to acknowledge that this is the work of many. I also want to emphasize that this is very much a work in progress and it is continuing to evolve and improve. The department has been developing a racial and social equity plan for about 3 years now. The first phase of this work started with an examination of our internal workings as a department and created trainings and tools to make sure our staff can integrate the value of equity into all aspects of our work. Now we are in phase 2, and we're asking, how do we do our work, and are we doing it in a way that promotes equity? Additionally, the newly created Mayor's Office of Racial Equity is going to be monitoring our work and the work of all city departments to make sure that we are meeting our commitments. Part of the equity work has been acknowledging the role that urban planning has played in creating and reinforcing structural and institutional racism. As historians and preservationists, many of us are already familiar with these events or similar discriminatory policies that were implemented by municipalities. Policies that have historically pushed American Indian, Black, and other people of color to poverty, isolation, and displacement. It is important to remind ourselves and our profession of the persistence of racist policies throughout our history, from the manifest destiny belief that European Americans had the right to conquer and displace the indigenous people, to anti-Asian policies like the Cubic Air Ordinance, the Laundry Ordinance, and Japanese incarceration during World War II, to redlining and exclusionary zoning practices that have extraordinary impacts to the Black community and others. Similarly, it is important for us to acknowledge the role that our profession as historians, preservationists, and other cultural resource professionals have played in institutional and structural racism. So just looking at Adrian Scott Fine's presentation, it's interesting to note that LA has about 4 times the number of landmarks that San Francisco has, but we're actually at about the same percentage, around 10%, that have associations with underrepresented communities. So both cities certainly have a long way to go in that regards. And in an effort to direct our work to meet equity priorities, in July of 2020, the Historic Preservation Commission and the Planning Commission both passed resolutions to center our work on racial and social equity. This led to the development of a community equity division with dedicated staff. The resolution directs the planning department to center its preservation program and resource allocation on equity. And I think that this is pretty notable that all of our work should center around equity. Significantly, it both acknowledges and apologizes for the history of racist, discriminatory, and inequitable historic preservation policies that have resulted in racial disparities. And the resolution recommends that the department develop proactive strategies to address and redress structural and institutional racism. The Commission's resolution includes a list of actions that are specific to the Historic Preservation Work Plan. This list is just some of the work that is currently being undertaken by preservation staff, and I am sure as this work continues, it will be the topic of future training sessions. But beyond these programs, the department is not only developing proactive strategies, but also looking at our current processes. As stated here, our task is a deliberate and measured examination of our field to identify practices that perpetuate racial and social inequalities and to replace those with creative and open approaches to incorporate new ways of honoring and sustaining cultural heritage. I am here today to share some of these tools. So how do these recent policies and changes connect back with our regulatory framework and our day-to-day work? One of the tools that we have in our toolkit is historic review through the California Environmental Quality Act, also known as CEQA. There are two main steps in CEQA. The first is to determine if a property is considered to be a historic resource. The second is to determine if there is an impact on that resource. When deciding if something is a resource, it's important that we look beyond just the year built, the early context of the neighborhood, and the building's architectural merit. Many sites throughout San Francisco now have layers of history, and later contexts must be explored as well. The example on this slide is a building commonly known as the Takahashi Trading Company at 200 Rhode Island Street, which was constructed in 1912 and is an early example of the work of master architect Albert Landsberg. However, through CEQA review, we also determined an additional context as it was under the long-term ownership of prominent Japanese American entrepreneurs and philanthropists, Henry and Tomoye Takahashi. The Takahashi family had been displaced from their original Japantown location in the 1960s through the city's redevelopment efforts. The building was thus determined to be eligible for its association with events central to the city's Japanese American community and with the Takahashi family themselves, as well as for its architectural merit. Pending Board of Supervisors approval, the property is now slated to join a very short list of only 3 other landmarks strongly associated with San Francisco's Japanese American community. CEQA can also evaluate entire historical districts. In 2017, a historic district was identified in the south of Market neighborhood due to the strong concentration of sites associated with the leather and LGBTQ community. Sites within this district are offered some protection from demolition or redevelopment, and furthermore, through working with community groups such as the Cultural District, which I'll talk more about later, we have successfully required developers to include interpretive plaques on the sidewalk and building facades to commemorate the neighborhood's rich history. In general, there are a standard suite of mitigation measures to reduce cultural resource impacts. If there is going to be an impact on that resource, then through CEQA, we can craft mitigation measures to lessen those impacts. Often when we talk about mitigation measures, we are focusing on lessening impacts to historical resources, ensuring that the mitigation measures are balanced with the impact, determining if there is a nexus between the impact and the required mitigation action, and ensuring that the measure is feasible and that it is fully enforceable. And while these are all very important aspects of crafting mitigation measures, focusing on just these requirements doesn't result in creative thinking about mitigation and can result in sticking to the standard measures. We are continuing to think about creative mitigation measures and how they can benefit community groups. We have a number of historical context statements, all of which can be accessed via our website. We are shifting just from neighborhood-based statements to context statements with cultural themes, including several with underrepresented communities. This includes our completed Japantown, LGBTQ, and South of Market Filipinos context statement, as well as our Latinx, African American, and Chinese American context statements, which are currently underway. These documents include a wealth of information, including criteria for evaluating properties for historical significance, as well as for identifying potential city landmarks. So we now have 300 individual city landmarks, and with an equity lens, we are working to ensure that this list fully represents the diversity of ethnic and cultural groups who have called San Francisco their home. Despite a small staff dedicated just to landmarking and a large and growing list of potential landmarks, we are steadily making progress. As historic context statements are completed, the work program grows, however, as new sites are added to the list with those associations. This is in addition to landmark designations which are proposed by our Board of Supervisors or by community groups. This slide is meant to illustrate the value of a context statement. To date, 7 city landmarks have been identified as having LGBTQ associations. The 3 on the lower left of the slide were the first to be designated, all before 2016. And 2016 marked a pivotal year in San Francisco LGBTQ preservation as the citywide LGBTQ context statement was adopted. Since then, the list has more than doubled with the designation of these 4 other sites. It's worth noting, however, that not only has the number increased, but the list has become more diverse. The geographical representation has expanded beyond just the Castro district, as newer sites are located in other neighborhoods throughout the city. Furthermore, we now have a site associated specifically with the leather subculture, with the San Francisco Eagle Bar, a site associated with a strong lesbian association with the Leo Martin House, and a site associated with an LGBTQ person of color with the Japanese YWCA. Of course, this is just the beginning, and we have a long way to go to ensure full representation. For example, none of these sites yet have strong transgender associations, though this may change soon as there has been discussion on designating the Compton's Cafeteria site. This was the site of 1966 community riots against police harassment, which marked a pivotal moment in transgender activism. We're also in the relatively early stages of the San Francisco Citywide Cultural Resources Survey, which is a multi-year effort to identify and document places of cultural, historical, and architectural importance to San Francisco's diverse communities. SF Survey provides an opportunity to take steps to center preservation in racial and social equity, better reflecting the dynamic cultural resources that make San Francisco unique. The findings of SF Survey will help guide the planning department's work on future landmark designations, heritage-based initiatives, environmental review, new development projects, area plans, and building permit applications. In parallel, the planning department is researching a survey approach to consider the non-physical aspects of a community's cultural heritage, also known as intangible cultural heritage. This includes oral traditions and expressions, performing arts, social practices, rituals and festivals, and traditional crafts. Initial research has involved the engagement of cultural districts, knowledge bearers, and advocates, as well as other city agencies through focus groups that explored the why and the how to document intangible cultural heritage. Finally, I'll just end with a quick overview of San Francisco's Cultural District program. Beginning in 2018, we now have 9 cultural districts. These districts are designated by the Board of Supervisors with boundaries encompassing neighborhoods of historically marginalized groups. The vision is to preserve, strengthen, and promote cultural communities, and its goals are to support legacy businesses, nonprofits, community arts, and traditions. Neighborhood-based community groups and their cultural values lead each district's efforts. Each cultural district maintains a community-based advisory board, staffing, and ongoing community and city partnerships. To meet each district's objectives, a strategic plan is developed called the Cultural, History, Housing, and Economic Sustainability Strategies, also known as a CHESS report. The CHESS report serves as a roadmap for cultural heritage and community stabilization and is updated every 3 years. The Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development coordinates the Cultural District Program and manages the funding. So that is all I have. I would like to thank other San Francisco Planning Department staff who contributed to this presentation, including Shelley Caltagirone, Maggie Smith, Rich Sucre, and Allison Vanderslice. I'd further like to thank the entire preservation team and other planning department staff for all of this hard work on this issue. And I am now, along with the other panelists, available to answer any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I would invite Lauren and Adrian to come back as well. Thank you. So we have a few minutes for questions, luckily, and I'll just start by saying thank you to everyone for your presentations today, and thank you to everyone again who joined us. We're really excited that there's so much interest. Again, we had hundreds of people sign up for this webinar, so it's really exciting to see that everyone is interested and engaged. So I'm going to start. We have just FYI, if you haven't been paying attention, the Q&A section, we have been trying to answer some of the questions as we've been going along, and then those get moved to the answered tab. So if you saw something but then it disappeared, that might be why, and check that out. But I'm going to start with there's been a series of questions from Jacob, and thanks, Jacob, for joining and weighing in and asking questions. And I'm just going to say, I think they're complicated questions and not necessarily easy to answer in a minute or two. But I will say, I think one of the big things, and this goes to how Adrian kicked us off, which is, I've had the same question he did, which is like, who am I to speak on this topic, right? I think a lot of it involves self-education and learning, and I certainly am not an expert, and I'm still learning and will make mistakes, I'm sure. But I think the process is about learning, and so there is a lot of self-education that has to go into this, and there are a ton of resources out there. One of the outcomes, I think, of this webinar and future things that NAPC is doing is that hopefully there will be some resource lists provided that can help. In the meantime, I'm happy to be emailed if you want to know some of the things I've read or looked at. Jacob, I think we're all available and could share some of the things that we all individually have looked at. And Lauren has shared some of them today in the handouts and in her presentation. So yeah, it's an educational process. And so that would just be what I encourage. And Lauren, was there anything you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I think that was part of the comment I made in my presentation that spurred the question. But anyone and everyone should be comfortable speaking out against discrimination, racism, championing social justice, and also speaking to their own experiences. And more what I meant was that we need to be careful about speaking in spaces where we're talking about someone's experience, someone's opinion, where they come from. So, speaking about, for example, like the Native American experience is probably not something that I should do as someone who's not part of the Native American community. Speaking on the Black experience is not something you should do if you are not part of that community as well. Now, there are many people who specialize and are experts in different cultures and groups that they are not part of, but it really takes a lot of time to develop that language, to speak with people from those groups to really develop that understanding. So I just ask that you always be careful about when you're speaking in a space that you haven't experienced.
I would just add that I think the other piece to this is that, and Adrian, you said it just right in terms of that we're all learning and it's a education process. But I think the other piece to this is listening. Listening more to what communities care about, meeting them where they're at, and maybe taking some of our traditional systems and putting them to the side and thinking about, okay, how can we broaden the reach in terms of preservation's power? And I think I was very excited that the NAPC wanted to do this workshop because I haven't seen any conversations happening around this topic specifically to commissions and the work that they do. And I think we all agree it's some of the most important work in preservation. And it's also the area where we probably can improve greatly. And this is an opportunity. So I think rather than being uncomfortable or squeamish about like, how do I even step into this space? It's an opportunity to really tell stories that need to be told, but also to broaden our relevance and reach. And that is something I think we all want to be doing in terms of the preservation work.
Thank you. I think we have time for a couple more questions. One of the questions that got several votes is, can anyone speak to or provide information on the challenge of working with property owners that may not wish for difficult history to be brought to light?
That's a difficult question. I will say, having dealt with a few instances like this, it goes back to listening, but it does have it goes back to having a conversation and a dialogue with the communities and the broad community that has some relevance in terms of that place and that history. So it's some people would rather just like I said, erase or omit or get rid of places that tell or symbolize this history. And that may be the right approach, but it needs to happen with the community coming together to at least discuss that and think about, well, is that what we could be doing? Or maybe there's another way to look at this place that represents dark history, and maybe it could be recast in a new light, again, taking ownership of that space or place and tell the story or take ownership in terms of telling your story. So it really goes back to having a conversation. Unfortunately, I think a lot of communities skip that process or they don't give it enough attention.
Anyone else want to join in? Okay, let's do one more question. And I think this is a tricky one. It's from Sam, and I'll try to sum it up, but it's an issue with, he's referencing, Adrian, your presentation with the work in Los Angeles, but I think that we've all seen this in preservation, and I know this has been a topic in other conferences, is where the criteria A and B, so referencing National Register criteria, clearly aren't inclusive enough for us to move the needle, but I found it to be a hard sell within systems that adhere strictly to the Secretary of the Interior standards. So I think the question is, how can we address folks who see that criteria A and B is a sufficient fix for sites that may not look beautiful? But I think the larger question is this interplay, again, between this integrity, the National Register standards, the criteria, the Secretary of the Interior standards, and kind of the fixation that we have on that in preservation. Does anyone just want to weigh in on their thoughts on that?
I would just say we definitely have several examples of sites in San Francisco that aren't, we keep going back to architectural merit and that they might not have that, but they were important places for, particular community groups at the time. So it's less about, the character defining features we identify are ones that really had some relevancy to that particular time and place. And so we do try and encourage those to be preserved as fully as possible. But if there's been some alterations to those features, I think we're okay with some amount of alterations. We don't, I think it goes back to the integrity discussion and the challenges with stating that these sites have lost integrity because they have these important cultural associations, and maybe the architectural merit isn't so important in those cases.
I'd say too that those of you who have local ordinances, you can change your criteria, you can change your standards, you can create different types of categories for landmarking, conservation districts, individual landmarks, different sites. So I think that sometimes it's using new tools and also creating new tools that the system wasn't necessarily designed to support as it was.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. We are doing that as well with our design guidelines, for example. Again, here in Miami-Dade County, with the issues we're facing with sea level rise and flooding and climate change challenges, we are not discounting the Secretary of the Interior standards, but our most recent design guidelines that we adopted are really placing priority on our local decision making. In terms of what works for our community here in face of those challenges. So I think something similar can be done looking at this, in terms of designations, et cetera. Looking at your ordinances is really important. Definitely would echo that. Okay, so we are at time. And I'm just going to mention, I know that in the chat it's been mentioned, if you have further questions, please feel free to use the NAPC listserv if you're a member of that. Again, our contact information is under the speaker information and handouts. I think everyone is probably willing and able to be contacted if possible. And then just a few closing remarks. I want to thank you all again for attending today's webinar. We hope to continue the conversation, not only through the listserv, for example, but also through future events with NAPC and at this summer's conference, which if you're interested in joining us at the biennial conference with NAPC forum, it will include a variety of related educational sessions. Alex and I actually are on a panel very similar to this at the conference and would love to see you. Forum 2022 is taking place in Cincinnati from July 13th to 17th and explores a number of themes there that you can see there on the screen. And as always, in addition to that, the fundamentals and essentials that NAPC is famous for offering. There will be a series of roundtable discussions on different topics, but one of them is this topic of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And NAPC would like to hear from you. What issues are you facing in your community where this topic intersects? And actually, related to future webinars, if we could do the last poll, Marie, we are interested in hearing from you about what you might be interested in hearing in a part 2 of this webinar. What would you like a deeper dive on in relation to some of the topics we touched upon? And if you don't have the answer right now, feel free to reach out to us or to NAPC directly for future events. NAPC will continue to offer webinars like these at no cost to members. If you're not already a member, we encourage you to join for free access to ongoing virtual training opportunities. The next webinar will be Hidden Tools for the Decision-Making Process, the Staff and Commissioner Support System, taking place on August 18th. Stay tuned. And let me see. I had to fill out the poll too before I can see what's going on with the poll. So it looks like our top 2, let's see. Sorry, the top 2 were just the 2 that I put in because it didn't refresh yet. It looks like community engagement strategies are of definite interest, assessing integrity, that's the big one again, intangible cultural heritage, and intersectionality and layered histories. So those are some good guidance for a future session on this topic. But just a reminder again, all attendees will automatically, all attendees who register, all who registered will get a link to the recording for this. All attendees who attended live will get a certificate of completion sent to you as well. If you don't see these things by Monday, check your spam and junk mail, or feel free to reach out to us. And with that, I'll say thanks again to our presenters. It's been great to spend the afternoon with you. And thank you again to all of our attendees and registrants. I hope you have a great weekend.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Nice seeing
you.
Thank you all.